Curgin the Merkel Fatcher of Liam Ó Muirthile. Please welcome Liam Ó Muirthile.
Thank you very much, Liam. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Allagar and hInise as a text, but my presumption is that there are some people who are and others who are not. So I've done, just as an explanation, I've done some English outline drafts of the excerpts I've chosen, and I must emphasize that they're not for publication, obviously, but they're for just this occasion so that you can have an understanding of what exactly is going on in the text. But so I'll start off by reading an extract under the date. I'll explain these things as I go along. Can I just fix this mic a small bit here? Yeah. It's under the date 28/12/1919. I set off back the roads. When I'm in view of the White Strand, two fine young women are standing at the corner. Bride, a strong, active, tall, coarse one, and Máire, a stocky, muscular, short one. Which of you is the stronger? Who eats the most and who wears out the most clothes? I say to them. A hard question to answer, that one, says Bride, because a person who's not very strong often eats more than another who isn't. Do you see that lump there, she says? She would eat 3 times more food than I would in a week. And you can bet that my sack of sand is as heavy or even heavier than hers. And I would be well capable of carrying more for a bet. You've had a good go at the stocky one, says I. 'Tis many a time this scarecrow here, whose belly was never filled and who couldn't be, had a dig at me. And even if she has long bones, they're the big bones beneath a bad dog. And her family have a hard job keeping her full in the times we have now, says the stocky one. The dumpy one is making a show of you, I say to her, and don't let her get away with it. It's easy to see from this one, says Bride, that her jaw and teeth never stop grinding. A dumpy person is always a good eater, and there's no family without its own stocky one, and they say that the thick-set one is the worst of all of them for eating, says the tall one. Woe to you, says Máire. Even if I eat a bit more, I don't show it beside yourself who hasn't a pick in her bones. And no matter how long your shanks, I would have not the slightest fear, but that I would carry as much sand as you and more to the top of the village, she says. Bride jumped from where she was and caught her by the hair on the top of her crown, and she would not let go easily only I grabbed her arm. Máire shot up startled because she was injured, I suppose. She grabs a hold of her own bag and turns it over and says darkly to Bride to come on down again to the strand and to bring whatever they could carry back in the bags to this point, and that I would know which bag was the heaviest. Bride empties her own bag with deliberation. Away you go, you divil, she says. It didn't take them long to reach the roadway again, and they turned up the hill from the strand. By the time they reached the corner, if you had only the one laugh, you would have made it. Every bead of sweat on their faces was as big as a periwinkle. No wonder. 2 young women competing against each other and nearly exhausted. I myself was feeling a bit uneasy about all this when they reached me, because I wouldn't like to call one of them fish and the other meat. But Sean Green was approaching us by this time, coming towards the strand with his black donkey. Take a look and see which of these 2 bags is heaviest, I said to him. He caught a hold of a big one, lifted it off the ground. He looked at both of them and said, that one was the best of them. There you are now, you devil, says the chubby one, because it was her bag. They emptied out the bags, and Sean put the load on his own donkey. I have the Irish of that, but I don't think I'll I think I should. It's the only one really. I think the sound of the language is extremely important, and the rhythm of the language, just to get your ears attuned to the original, and then we'll speed on. William Shearson boited them hen, an aurk vochen a trabáinegum, bíon rá stúide in a stad gúne, Bride, skrisúnch garvard, agus Máire, balkar a town ísel. Kjoko givus treshe is mochahan bia, agus is mohogan iadachar smislio, kefst is dakker reitach ísinner sa Bride. Maar is minnig a chahandine nabian rá láidir nís mú bíg ná an te vín. Na ficken tú an talpachan san sise, dísach sí sinna sí het bíglum sa idir ráchean na seachtaine, agus bích geall gúil mavála ganí se chá traum nú nís trimen ná ceansan, agus is máistir a hille hútme na meach geall sís. Tá piak vatúra fé malcar gutar sa mise. Is minic rimise hugan chigilse nar líanach a bolagríomh agus nar véidre piak fumsa. Agus má tá cná fadike is siad na cná múra fé ravadriad. Agus tá obud ag a muintir í seoich mead lán sa teile táinisan san balcari. Tá tú de heo ag a malcar sa mise le agus ná lig léie. Is fristach a hent seo sa bríd na bíana carib díhhain. Ní réan balcar ná go míon gomachan a chuide chahaf. Agus ní réan bhuiir ná go míon balcar agus deir siad gur measa ghóibh an balcar is san ná an chuideil fad san stresúnach. Léanart sa máire má tá cahaf grama brise anm sa héin tá beagán dá rianarm seachas tusan ná fuil spide fia an chnábhleat. Agus tá aire ich líán ní bheoh puc aglarm ná go dúring ganíí an ráid go bar a bhaile leat agus níos mú siise. Thug bríide léim as an áit go raibh si, agus chur lábhan a chuig grúige a muile na bahas, agus ní go bog go bhucach mar a meoch gur chur is féin crúcas i gíag. Freab máir in na seasamh mar a stóch gur gunnichaí, berin a mála féin agus builan na bhíal faoi, agus dean go dúmh le bríide téanacht an síos ar a dráig a ríis, agus a méid bhí na gumas a thuút leo chus na mála iad a thuút leog dísa, agus go meochas a gumsa ceoch go mála bo srimme bheoch. Builan bríide a bhíal féin a cheann féin go rion. Se leat a dhéal siise, níor bhada go raibh an bhirt in imime bhóthir thar neis, agus iad casta gunne níird. An támar frihadar an cúne, mar meach éon gáir bháin bheoh sé dianta gut. Bhí go chéan deoid alas a bhí amach trína naid córáir le mingán trá. Níor bhúna san bert a bhná óga á díal héin a míle do gohamach. Níor á sa stiglam héin le líine de frihint godíime, mar nar bhailim íos go dhéanamh do gine agus feol don na nelle. Ach cébheoch in nach chomar dúin ach seánna grín a teachtar a dráig den asal dubh. Fiach ciocad an dábhála san na strumir san mise leis, rug sé ar cheann mór, bhog den dalabheith, déach sé an sanartha agus dúirt sé sin an ceannas maisiúlacha. Fiachan is dhéal san fantalóg mar ba é ceann féine, chahad ar astar an ghaine bhúnta, as chur seán ar asal féine. When I first read that passage in Allagar and hInise, I knew that it was unlike any other text I'd read in Irish, or in many other languages, in fact. We could spend much time, analysing and discussing the passage, the different words, for example, used to describe women, their specific physical characteristics. I think there's about 6 words in all, and different qualities. That's a feature of the Irish language, of course, but we won't spend our time analysing the text. I first encountered the text as a student many years ago in the university library, and each time I come to Allagar and hInise, I'm struck by something new. A turn of phrase, a point of view, a character come to life, a rhythm, a further understanding, a laying bare, a stripping away, even a frustration at times with repetition, which is the inevitable outcome of life on a small island. But it is an organically live text before my eyes, breathing, changing, and challenging, and it has never faltered. Allagar and hInise, our island crosstalk, as it has been translated, was the first published book from the Blasket Islands in the 20th century, a journal of island life, a book of days, as it were. Tomás Ó Criomhthain began writing his account in October 1918 and finished it about the beginning of 1923, when he went on to write his better-known autobiography, Tileánach, or The Island Man. The backdrop to the writing of the Allagar, then, is the defining political period of modern Ireland and the catastrophe of the First World War, the defining event of 20th century Europe. Ó Criomhthain was a 63-year-old widower with one son, Sean, living in the house when he began the journal. Up to this point, he'd been an occasional contributor to Irish language periodicals on Lochran and the Clay Solis among them. A stonemason by craft and a fisherman, he had his own plot of ground for potatoes and oats. He had known great sorrow, terrible personal tragedy with the loss of children, both daughters and sons, to accidents and illness, and had one son settled in America. He would soon lose another married daughter in the agony of childbirth. Only a short few years before 1909, his oldest surviving son, Donald, was drowned in an attempt to rescue Evelyn Constance Nichols, women's rights campaigner and active member of the Gaelic League from Rathgar in Dublin, when she got into difficulties while swimming off the White Strand in the Great Blasket. She was associated either intimately or otherwise with Padraig Pearse. Caught, Tomás's daughter, who was rescued from drowning in the same incident, was to be the mother who would die, giving birth to Padraig Ó Muirthile, who himself would go on to become a writer and lexicographer, as well as editor of his grandfather's work. There are two published versions of Allagar na hInise. Short version, this is the cover, just there. A short version, about 1/3 of the manuscript, edited by Padraig Ó Criomhthain under the pseudonym of Shauk, published in 1928, who gave the book its title, and a longer version edited by Padraig Ó Muirthile in 1977. Both editions are incomplete, and in fact, after consulting the manuscript in the National Library, I pointed out on the occasion of its publication that Padraig Ó Muirthile had omitted approximately 1/3 of the original in his 1977 edition, despite his claim that all had been included. Subsequently, another book, Allagar Adó, was published separately as an addendum. So we are still awaiting a complete and annotated edition of Allagar na hInise, which would A, present the text with the same care and scholarly judgment as Sean Ó Criomhthain did when he superbly re-edited and restored on Clonach, like an old master, and which I respectfully call on Clonach, and B, contain comprehensive notes to explain some of the obscure references to contemporary events, public figures, and social context, which are becoming even more obscure by the year. It is difficult at times to distinguish between the islanders themselves in the work, whether Sean is Sean Ó Criomhthain or another Sean, or whether Micheál or Michael is speaking, while others stand out because of their individual character or even political allegiance. Cashed, the obstructionist, and Redmond Knight, for example, or Old Owen, or Maney, Sean Ó Criomhtain's wife, or swarthy dark Sean Shea. Some characters make a very rare appearance. White, for instance, or Peg, who is unmistakable. In many respects, Allagar na hInise is a book of disembodied voices, our own collection of wind talkers. Early on in Allagar na hInise, Tomás has the following account. It's a beautiful little cameo of the writer's life as he sets about his work. I had completed the day's small tasks this afternoon, eaten supper, lit the lamp, spread out a sheet of the blue-tinted paper to write a draft after the day, readied a fancy pipe from America, and cut a plug of tobacco from this gentleman with one of my own knives. I had papers from the Gaelic League, of which quite a few were laid out on the table, having previously filled 2 other sheets of the blue paper, as well as a bottle of ink from Fionnán McCullum and a pen of his in my hand. Anybody who would see me propped at the table would say that I was employed by the king. I myself thought that I was well set up to do a bit of work, but when a person is too clever in their own mind, that's when they are prone to make mistakes, says the little yellow fellow, and that's the way it was with me. I lit my pipe, dipped the pen in the bottle, and started to write with gusto on the blue sheet. A young cat was sitting in the corner near the fire, and it's most likely he was keeping an eye on me as I began to write, and thought the bottle was a living thing, and that I was trying to push it away with the pen. He gave one leap onto the table, caught the bottle of ink under his paw, turned it right over onto the blue foolscap sheet, and leaped back again into his corner. It lifted me right out of my chair because I thought that someone had thrown some lump or chunk at me. The blue foolscap sheet was the only damage done, because the other items were to one side, but I'd rather have a 10-shilling note burned on me than that much itself. Since the little yellow fellow says everything takes after its own kind, I didn't shout, "Get out of that," to the cat, because no doubt he thought it was a mouse. This little cameo tells us an awful lot. The little yellow fellow, by the way, he crops up from time to time in Allagar, and he's a sort of alter ego or voice of conscience of O'Clihon's. In many ways, Allagar na hInise has had no right to exist. The reference to this gentleman is to Brian O'Calla or Brian Albert Kelly from Killarney, who was Tomás's supplier of goods and writing material and much more. I'll return to Brian shortly. Fionnán McCullum, the folklore collector, was another. But the little cameo tells us how consciously and conscientiously Tomás set about his writing. He sets out his tools for the job like any craftsman. He's also willing to tell a story at his own expense. But more than that, it's as if we are drawn in to a secular monastic scriptorium by a 20th century prose version of the Old Irish poem Pangur Bán, in the guise of his delinquent descendant, Pangurín Bán, who has become a playful devil with his own master instead of minding his own cat business. It's by chance, too, that the poem Pangur Bán came to light in a monastery in eastern Austria, and it also had no right to survive. In other respects as well, style, mentality, abruptness, sparsity, asceticism, syntax, the pervasive order of God's world, and even the shortage of paper. We have to look to Old Irish to find Allagar na hInise's antecedents. In that sense, and in many other ways, it reaches back through the centuries to a medieval society at least, with medieval values seemingly intact in the first decades of the 20th century. In the Stalinist George Thompson's apt phrase, a pre-capitalist society. But we may be returning to that form of society sooner than we think. And Allagar na hInise will have a new lease of life, despite the sparsity here tonight, as a template for inhabiting the world and our own environment. But for our purposes, we may read medieval, and I'm using the word in a very loose way, that if Ó Criomhthain had heard or read an Irish language version of the Odyssey, or of the poems of François Villon, he would have felt that they were written in his own world and from his own worldview. It was these medieval characteristics which drew scholars such as Robin Flower and Karl Mastrander and many others to the Blaskets. But Allagar na hInise is a work firmly of the 20th century, wrought through the prism of a medieval mind. It is closer to medieval life than the lives we live today. Tomás, though, is always the writer going about his daily life with a Zen-like detachment, reminiscent of Buddhist koans or the Japanese Zen master Ryokan's poems. His Allagar is the result not only of his writing sessions, such as already described, but also of many days and hours of contemplation. He says, Tesh dinerdum bolem shir chanan ghartúd, gomraham pedi slainte dalaundum mascarolum liline agantum boichas murle die. After dinner, I head for that field where I feel any ailment upon me as I go there, lifting from me as soon as I leave it, thanks be to God. We can hear his footfalls in the original, and prepositions which could otherwise be intrusive, regulating the beats of his feet. He often sits on his perch in Gorton Trombone, but does not always reveal what goes on there. What we have on the page, then, is a distilled essence with phrases that have the lift-off of poetry or the lyrical out-there-ness of the natural world in Old Irish lyrics. It's not the written text only that we have to learn to read, but the spaciousness around the text that we have to learn to comprehend, such as the ill health and how does it dissipate in the above quotation. Where does it go? And this is true of Old Irish poetry too. There's a little four-line poem from Gerald Murphy in his book called Early Irish Metrics. It's Idiv Magamwikin Mailesh Lim Hecht Edram Lesh Avridin Rohraum Lesh Hecht. The ploughman of the pig's plain, he likes thick, fresh milk, quick to strike his goad, weary of his plough's weight. That's a scene which could have been written by Tomás Ó Criomhthain, except he probably wouldn't consider it to be a poem, but he would admire the craft, its physicality and its humanity. Allagar na hInise is the progenitor of every other work of note from the Blasket Islands, the founding text of the Blasket Island Library in Muirish MacNeill's original phrase. It's playful, mischievous, deadly serious, wise, razor-sharp, witty, harsh in some of its judgments on other people. It's our own book of Socratic dialogues, written by a man of deep understanding and intelligence, a realist in much the same as, say, the French 19th century school of realism painters, and who had a third eye and an ear for dialogue, which is a type of inner harmony, a sixth sense for the music of every living thing on the sounding board of language. Just one small example in Irish, of a short phrase and then a translation. December 1918, at Shrovetide, when marriages were arranged, there's a conversation between two characters about who might be getting married. One says to the other, Tá long áirigh the yanks at Teachtavalli agus tá van hain cappa the gach fard an the Manásin. Uchtar muir sa Sean, mas a tnúlis na Shanna Yelsin, a táid siad náfuil fiacal in a gown, agus a tá melte ag muilte verike, cabwa mar ariad shishin. There's a boatload of Yanks coming home, and every one of them has had an island woman assigned to him. Och, by the Virgin Mary, says Sean, if it's longing they are for those old devils who haven't a tooth left in their heads and who've been ground down by the mills of America, they're not men at all. Keep them away from me, says he. But the phrase, melte ag muilte verike, is damning in its original rhythmic beats, but also shows how aware the islanders are of what's really going on in America, the home of the majority of the Blasket Islanders, and where they make their living on the daily grind. An example of the devastating harshness of life on the Blaskets is the following. Myself and another mason are working on Bell's house. Don O'Connade is the other man. Some people pass by as they head up along. Shame on you for working when there's a person lying dead in the village, they remark in passing. There's always joking of that sort going on, and with that in mind, we took no more notice of what they were saying today than any other day. Donkeys carried loads of turf, and a few people were tilling the fields. It wasn't long before more people came by. Micheál was among them. This island is going to the dogs altogether, Kennedy, says he. What's your reason for saying that, says the other fellow. Oh, a dead person in the village, my son, says he. And I never had a hard day's work to do until today, my dear fellow, says Micheál. She was a 1-year-old child, and some people stopped working, others continued on throughout the day. Because we were caught up with the building work and there was pressure on us, we kept going. After dinner, men passed by on the way up carrying spades on their shoulders. Where are those fellows off to, asks Kennedy. Cutting turf, answers another man. And why do they stop working all morning when they're heading off to work now, says he. The funeral is over now, says Micheál, and she's buried. It's a pity, says Kennedy, they didn't bury her as soon as she died. I mean, you know. There are implications in the text, again, which can be analysed subtext. For instance, my own hunch on first reading that piece was that O'Connade wasn't from the Blaskets, that he was a mainlander. And in another entry, Ó Criomhthain tells us that he was indeed from Ballaghailse or from the Gortadú near Ballinarterig. But he doesn't seem to want to tell us this in the extract. So there's a huge subtlety going on in some of the texts, and you have to be careful how you read them. You know, you have to be very careful how you read them. Your instincts have to be tuned up and get used to. There's a subtlety in the way the islanders write about everything that has to be. You have to do a second and a third and a fourth take to get it sometimes. But anyway, Ó Criomhthain's distancing himself from O'Connade. And then Micheál, I'm just going through elements of the text, Micheál addressing O'Connade as Muinich and Dalt in Irish, terms of endearment, which we would not expect of two men while one disapproves of the other, and the fact that only children were buried on the island where there was no graveyard. Micheál not addressing Ó Criomhthain directly, or at least Ó Criomhthain not saying so, but those issues are perhaps dealt with by ethnologists and maybe anthropologists. But this is no Celtic twilight community. It's the community of hunters and gatherers where rampant infant mortality and common fatal illness is the norm, and daily survival, a surrender to God's will, then self-reliance, an intimate connection with the landscape and seascape, and skilled seamanship. When Ó Criomhthain looks out to sea as he shelters from the heat on a May day, he sees porpoises making way in the Blasket Sound, 6 in all, the parents and 4 young porpoises. In the old days, the islanders would never call a woman a lady unless she had a porpoise skin around her neck or on her hand. The skin made a good price in those days. Those porpoises out in the Sound were worth £30, £5 each. When they'd gone out of sight, 2 large speckled seals followed on with a young seal with them. The seal never had more than one. The porpoises are like the dog. They have between 3 and 6 pups. Very often a man came to the island on a visit with jewels and bling hanging from him, but he would never be regarded by the islanders as a real lord unless he wore a sealskin waistcoat. The islanders made a good living at times from those animals in the old days. No porpoises or seals are being brought home now, and it's a long time since they were. Besides life and death then, what else is there? Nothing much happens on this island of perhaps 200 people, except the daily comings and goings of the islanders going about their business. Setting out fishing, heading by sea to Dunquin or Dingle, tackling donkeys to bring home a load of turf or branches of firs, watching the sea for changes in weather, watching for the post from the mainland, watching other people's movements, where they're going to or coming from, what they're carrying, descriptions of the seasonal changes, growing crops, potatoes and oats, the price of flour and yellow meal, the price of sugar and tea and shoes and porter and whiskey in the Dingle shops and pubs, and the constant talk and dialogue, whether reported or imagined, between islanders at various crucial gathering points or individual houses on the island. Ó Criomhthain cannot have been present at all of the exchanges and fulfills his perceived role as a writer in creating or recreating dialogue, even in imagining short interior monologues for his characters. One of his techniques is to provoke, as we've seen, or wind up others in order to get them to reveal themselves. He's not a natural storyteller in the sense of creating a fiction out of nothing, creating a fiction, as I say myself, to tell the truth, as it were. He did not have that understanding of a writer's role, nor could he. He says himself that he doesn't believe in gjuffericht, or silly chatter, referring to the horned carcass of a ram, picked clean by animals when he's startled by its appearance at night time on the narrow road near his house. What he means is the apparition of the devil, or another world apparition. But to return to the other character in this work, to Brian O'Calla, or Brian Albert Kelly. Cogad na Franke, hug Brian O'Calla home. The war in France brought Brian Kelly to me, says Tomás at one point, referring to the First World War. The backstory to Allagar and hInise is intriguing. We are well aware of some of the facts of Brian Kelly's life, how he came to the Blaskets, and how through his relationship with Tomás, he encouraged the Blasket man, goaded him even, like our ploughman above, to set about the task of writing. His intervention was crucial. In many ways, we owe the whole Blasket Island project, or Homeric Island of Ios, to this troubled young man's faithful and fortuitous presence on the island. He was carrying a huge burden with him into the Blaskets, a dark, personal secret, which his relationship with Tomás may have relieved or allayed. An Seoc refers to him as an Einaránach, a loner, and Támáilte, reticent, eager, sensitive, and seems to have become something of a confidant later. It is An Seoc who was asked by Brian's mother to teach him Irish in 1916, and after a few sessions gave him a letter of introduction for the Blasket Island sojourn. Killarney, born in 1889 to a well-to-do business family, his father a justice of the peace, his mother a cronan from Kanturk in North Cork, it must be said. He had been educated at Clongowes Wood by the Jesuits and graduated with a degree in languages from Trinity College. Joyce had only gone out the door of Clongowes when Brian Kelly arrived. He won a prize for Old Irish while in Trinity and appears to have had some active interest in an Irish language society. He says himself that he spent some time in the Sorbonne in Paris and had completed a term in the University of Marburg in Germany when the First World War erupted. A brother of Brian's, 1 year younger, Thomas Kelly, much later was to end his career in the British Royal Air Force as an Air Vice Marshal. So we have their political allegiance on a plain sheet. Without going into too much detail about the intrigues of Irish Revolution, etc., Sir Roger Casement was a central figure in Germany at this time, 1914 and early 1915, and was instrumental in Brian's release from detention being a British subject. Brian and Casement struck up a relationship. And while Casement's efforts at raising a regiment of Irish prisoners of war in Germany to be shipped to Ireland for revolution were futile and fruitless, talks were continually going on at the highest political level to engage Irish nationalists in the war for Germany's benefit. Brian was a literary scholar, probably somewhat naive about political intrigue, but he too was interviewed by high-level civil servants in the German corridors of power. He had at an early stage written to Kuno Meyer, the great Celtic scholar and first editor of Old Irish nature lyrics in Berlin, but had received no reply. Meyer himself, and his sons especially, were engaged in the war effort. Brian managed to get passage home to Ireland from Germany. What was agreed with him, what activity he might be engaged in, we do not know at this point, but we now know that he entered into a secret agreement on arriving home, or may have been pressured into making a statement about his knowledge of Casement's revolutionary activities in the Germany at war. This is the first time you'll have heard this now. He made an oral statement to the Chief Secretary, Augustin Birrell, with his Under-Secretary, Matthew Nathan, as witness, regarding Casement's plotting against the British. He then made a comprehensive written statement, setting out in very clear terms what his own and Casement's dealings were with the German authorities. This statement was then typed out in a very coherent and literary style with double quotation marks for dialogue, marked secret, and sent to the British Prime Minister, with a covering letter from Nathan outlining the background and scene by the British War Cabinet, including the then Chancellor Lloyd George, with the date February the 11th, 1915 on the cover page. Brian Kelly made the statement on the undertaking that nothing in it would be used in evidence against Sir Roger Casement. There are two handwritten and initialed remarks on the cover page of the document, one stating that it was a pity such an undertaking had been given to Brian Kelly, and the other that the undertaking had to be honoured. The document is also marked as read by Prime Minister Asquith and seen by Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War. Even if the British did not break their undertaking de jure, Kelly's statement de facto made Casement, if ever caught, a condemned man. When Brian Kelly arrived by Naivog at the Great Blasket in April 1917, he'd only to glance northwards to Inishtuashgert and beyond to visualise where Casement had landed and wonder what his own role might have been in his downfall. On Blascaid Moor must have been a welcome refuge away from the turmoil of Irish Revolution, learning Irish until at least the end of the year from an exceptional man. It was out of that relationship, an unlikely alliance, that Allagar and hInise would come to life. The other question we have to ask is how it happened that Tomás Ó Criomhthain could write in Irish, considering the very low level of literacy, so-called, among the Irish-speaking population. One of his characters asks one day, did you hear the papers today? Meaning that the newspapers were read out loud, of course. I believe that there's no doubt whatsoever but that the Protestant mission to evangelise West Kerry in the 19th century, driven among others by the Catholic convert to the Church of Ireland and ordained clergyman Tomás Ó Muirthile from Dingle, was a huge factor in Tomás Ó Criomhthain's writing and reading skills in both Irish and English. We know from Brownon O'Connor's research and work in his valuable book, Tomás an Blascaid, about the fortunes of the Church of Ireland school on the Great Blasket. Tomás Ó Muirthile, disparagingly called Tomás an Éhig, Tom of the Lies, was a very enlightened man and believed that reading and writing were the key to personal freedom, that education and church services in their own language were the population's right. He made many visits to the Blaskets, and despite the vicious enmity of the Catholic Church and the landlord of the Blaskets, Clarissa Hussey, who leased the island from Lord Cork, had made inroads into the community through education and had established a Protestant church in Dunchain. Tomás Ó Criomhthain, even if the school had been closed in 1860-1864, when he was between 5 and 9 years of age, had close relatives in Ballykeen, just next to the Protestant church in Dunquin, and had surely learned the basis of his reading and later writing with those relatives or others who had fruitfully attended the school on the island. So we have two factors which are crucial in the writing of Allagar and hInise: biblical evangelism, learning to read the Bible in one's own language, and political betrayal, Brian Kelly's statement of an Irish patriot. This is the complete antithesis of the Irish revival, hijacked for nationalist and separatist political ends, and what would later become narrow gauge Gaelic nationalism. There's an example of the type of bawdy ribaldry that goes on in some of Tomás's writing, not a lot. This is an example of one piece which I decided to stick in. And it's the only piece of writing where he refers to himself in the third person. And it's interesting that he does so because it's probably the most bawdy piece, if you like, that in the whole book. And I wonder if he's trying to distance himself by using the third person. But anyway, I'll read this first in Irish and then I'll do the translations. 20th of the 11th, 1919. Bíonn Tomás a chun mhóthairde agus tagann sé suas le Siobhán a bhíonn scaitheamh roimh amach. Ní miste leis bualadh lethe mar cailín suilte bethe, agus fear grín a bethe féin. Dá dheasca sin is fada go mbeanna lehéadí cortha dá chéile, mar bíonn a górá a giriúnt dá chéile. Mo rá de cholapa de rút agus de chuis Siobhán ar sisin, ní cim cos ar aanach in amach a saoil, tán, ráur, gléigeal. Tá chud is fearde as taur cuise ar sisin, suas a hilis tahagaí agus is fear chlóí, agus féocht dá dhéad tánta gúil breulart, agus ná déir fá bailíoram. Sin rud nach gácha maráileat mar tí lán wahanna ar sisin, do gine nábeach mar sinna dirich an rí, féachanta do cochéin chríarach tá chrí roimpe ortsa. It's a beautiful rhythm in the way they use it's unique. There's beautiful rhythm in some of the stuff. The way they turn around prepositions and get them all over the place. You can't imitate it. Ma tá ma chosasa a fiachan tainimach ditche féin ar siise, nach ma is a gutsa kunst tá chudelidium. Tugtar túrim den chrán as a bhún ar sisin agus bogólim gúil ó da chlináin se leis go dí ár da gromad a réir da chos. Gan chlináin ná tón ar da rírógre, ní carta te bheith maga fún téis massa hír. Tomás is walking the roadway and he catches up with Siobhán, who is some way ahead of him. He likes to meet her as she's full of fun, and he himself likes to have a laugh. Because of that, they never tire of each other. They get on well. I love your calves, your ankles and your legs, Siobhán, he says. I never see legs to match them at a fair, strong, full, shining bright. The best is out of your sight, Musha, says she. Up further, they're more solid and shapely and sharp as you are. Look how foolish you are too, not wishing the blessing of God on me. I've no need to say that because you were in fine fettle already, says he. That blessing would suit somebody who wasn't as well as you are, with the hope she might get well, but you were the finished article. If my legs are pleasing to yourself, says Siobhán, isn't it well you know how the rest of me is? The tree is judged by its stump, says he, and I would guess that your flanks up to the arch of your back are as fine as your legs. May you be without flank or arse yourself, you art rogue. You shouldn't be mocking the worst person you see before you. Can you imagine the riot that would have provoked in the Abbey Theatre if they knew what the Irish peasantry was getting up to, you know? And it's about as distant in every way from the Irish revivalist mentality of an glean in tógach mé agus bás an chrappaí. They were, you know, and in a sense, my own feeling always has been that they come from two different, completely different worlds. In a sense, it was sort of a tragedy in one way that they tried to impose Victorian values through the Irish language on that sort of a community. It just didn't work. It didn't work. It just didn't fit from the beginning. Tomás Ó Criomhthain had many songs in his head, as well as the poems of the Blasket Island poet Sean O'Dine, whom Liam Ó believes was the catalyst for Tomás Ó Criomhthain in becoming a writer. Tomás Ó Criomhthain, as Liam said, is a poet writing prose, luckily for us. But the truth of the matter is that Brian O'Calla brought a modern sensibility, a European sensibility to the Blaskets. It was Brian who sensed that Ó Criomhthain had a major contribution to make as a writer. We know that he introduced Tomás to Maxim Gorky's Life and Pêcheur d'Islande by Pierre Loti, the French writer, to Growth of the Soil by Knut Hamsun, and that they read Siena by Antar Padar O'Lear together. What influence these works may have had on Ó Criomhthain is speculation. He says that he has long cart asel the Laura Satig, a donkey cart load full of books in the house. His son Sean, who later wrote Lord Orsale, may have read them rather than his father. just as an interjection here, I remember reading a piece by John McGahern many years ago about the difficulties of translating even that phrase, Lád ar sail. Lád ar sail means a sort of we had a great day, an extraordinary day. And, you know, it means the day of our lives, I suppose. But I remember John ruminating, I think he was writing something, I can't remember exactly what the context was now, but I remember what he came up with in the end was a day out of all the days of our lives, which I thought was a wonderful way of expressing the underlying meanings of Lád ar sail, you know. So anybody translating the work from the Blaskets into English has a major task, and I think Allagar hInise especially has huge challenges. I think you nearly have to create a type of sort of a syntax of its own to deal with the syntax of the Blasket Island Irish, which is different in many respects. From like it's not enough to do a sing job on it. It's not enough to create a type of woolly, soft, lyrical language to get a hold of what Ó Criomhthain is saying. It's not that. That's not the way to do it. There's a hardness, there's a flint-like hardness in Ó Criomhthain's writing that has to be found in translation as well. But anyway, I have to continue with Brian Kelly's story because it's crucial to understanding what Allagar hInise is about. Brian stayed until the end of 1917 and possibly later on the Blasket, tutored by Tomás. He left in Blasket Moor for a few days once or twice to bring back books or other items. They developed a father-son relationship, a close intimacy. Brian, I feel, replacing Tomás's lost son, Donald. There are poems by Tomás for Brian. It would be easy to misread them as homoerotic, but they are coming out of the Greek tradition. They're coming out of the classical Greek tradition. So, you know, it's a father and a son. It's his concern for the young man. When Brian left, he took up a post as an inspector of national schools in 1918 in return for his casement statement, more than likely. He kept up correspondence with Tomás from the mainland, supplying him with writing materials and tobacco. He also wrote to others on the island. He bought dresses for some of the women. Muirish O'Sullivan's sister, Laois, got a dress from him, you know. So as I was saying, Tomás has a fatherly affection and concern for Brian, wondering when he might get married. He would never marry. It was Brian, mostly writing in English, who suggested that Tomás write an account of life on the Blaskets, that he describe, in an inspired moment, that he describe what is before his eyes. To understand Allagar hInise, we have to read it initially at least as a continuing dialogue between Tomás and Brian, an account of the continuing lives of some of the characters Brian would have come to know while he stayed on the Blaskets, and who he had now left behind. Tomás would fill the foolscap pages, dated on the day they were posted by Brian, post them back, and Brian would supply a new batch. When he had completed the Allagar, he set to work on Tileanach. Political events took their course. Brian had the manuscripts. The Free State was founded. He was suspected by senior civil servants of the Free State of betraying casement. The file containing his statement had been removed from the filing cabinets in Dublin Castle and locked away in Downing Street in the Prime Minister's safe. I just have to explain here, I'm not at liberty to give you the full sources for this, but I'm working with Muirish McConnell. I'm just helping him to write a full biography of Brian O'Calla, which is long overdue, really. And to Muirish I owe this information. But Brian was under a dark cloud as Inspector of National Schools and felt completely isolated. He carried the manuscripts in a satchel to Paris at one stage, and in my own idle moments I imagine an encounter between Kelly and Joyce in Saint-Germain, two Clongowes ex-pupils, one the great modernist who just published Ulysses, and the other showing him the work of an island man from the Great Blasket, Odysseus himself, alive and well, and holed up in a felt-roof cottage sheltering under a hill, but with a great view. I'm serious, you know. I think they're the two great pieces of work in the 20th century in Ireland. and reflecting each other as well. Hero, anti-hero, etc. Even if the meeting never took place, I have a feeling Tomás Ó Criomhthain's work must have influenced Joyce in some fashion, even if only by osmosis. I think I'll go along that road someday and write a fiction of the encounter that never took place between Kelly and Joyce, and Joyce's reaction when he saw this manuscript from. I mean, he actually did have the manuscripts in a satchel in Paris, and I just have to imagine, like, Joyce amazed, you know, see, how could this happen, you know? I mean, what's going on here, you know? I've just written Ulysses. You can't do this to me, you know. You know, you have no permission to do this to me. Like, I might as well write that. I might as well go hell for leather and write Finnegan's Bloody Wake or something. You know, get rid of, you know, forget it all, blow it all up. You know. Unshaug tells us that Kelly entrusted the manuscripts to him, and their publication is another story. But Brian Albert Kelly resigned from the Free State Civil Service and headed for exile, possibly through a Jesuit network in Croatia. So the the priest network in Croatia was working well before the Second World War. Anyway, we're only told that vi faha leshin. There are reasons for that by Unshaug, no more. How could it possibly be for any other reason than the suspicion, at least, or even the knowledge that Kelly had made his written statement detailing Casement's so-called treason? Sight of Delights. This is a piece by Tomás Ó Criomhthain here. I spent many an August day on this island, but I have never before seen the likes of this day. For some time now, I usually head back along the road where the crops are growing. If I get a bit more health, that will keep me going there. I halted at the bottom of a field which the young man, Brian O'Calla, called the White Strand Field because it overlooks it. The two of us often spent part of the day there speaking the language of the ancestors and the great men. There's a rock at the top where Brian used to sit, and as he had named the field, I called the rock Brian's Chair. It's still there and will remain there. A fellow couldn't do much work during the day in this field, unlike other fields, because of the remarkable sights that would meet your eye all of a sudden. That's the power of the eyes. Vision makes things strange. As I sat on this rock where young Kelly used to sit, I cast my eye around over sea and land. I don't know if any other bodily eye under the sun had the power to see such a spectacle from a single grassy patch as my own eyes saw at this time, and every wonder telling me that it was the Holy Master that directed them. Human affairs were of no wonder to me. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon as the bright sun headed northwards. The cliffs on the mainland ran all along before me now, and no two colours were the same on any two cliffs, because their natural colours were different. Every cliff, cove, and shore had its own natural colour, and the brilliant sun didn't change them at this time either, if it didn't enhance them. At the two ends of Dunquin Parish, which was before our eyes, there was a sight which was never there before, because there was only invaders' gorse there always. Instead of that gorse, there are 4 bright, sparkling houses at each end of the parish. They were colourful, erected by the Congested Districts Board, and I would venture that the same board is one wing of the home government for poor people. The Holy House of God was in the heart of the parish, well coloured at this time, and anybody who would see its windows sparkling in the sun wouldn't hesitate to think of the blessed kingdom above to which it belonged. When I cast my eyes on the wide sea, there was a war fleet in the bay north, 6 warships together, powerful and ornate, a dozen trawlers from Dingle in the bay south, and many small mackerel fishing boats among them. And they vogue beside every rock in the waterways with their own fishing gear, from the seine purse net to the lobster pot. Then, when I looked across at the White Strand, another wonder struck me, because at first I thought I saw seals or porpoises, but I was mistaken. When I peered at them, it was clear they were women, about 24 women, and it was no wonder I thought they were porpoises, because every young woman among them was as skillful as a porpoise in the waves. When I turned from this strand, I could see what is called Gary's Strand, and there was a crowd of young men swimming there just as well. Each tribe has its own stretch of strand for this purpose, without any connection between them. Brian Kelly found refuge in Split in Croatia, where he had another confidant, a Jesuit priest, Father Kolbe. I feel he must have often looked out on the island in the Adriatic, about the same distance from Split as Ambluscad Moor is from the mainland, in contemplation, just as his mentor and great friend Tomás Ó Criomhthain sat in contemplation in Gorton Trabagne, overlooking the Atlantic. They had a symbiotic relationship. In a sense, they were never apart. Who knows if they met in some other sphere? Brian Albert Kelly died of polio in 1936, the year before Tomás died. He's buried near Split. We owe him so much, and we owe them both so much. Can we have